strength, power, confidence. We are not here to be the victims of sexual abuse. We're here to disrupt the energy around sexual abuse, helping victims and survivors recreate their story to live an empowered life.
I'm Officer Borders.
And I'm Firefighter Pierce.
Join us as we raise the roof and open the doors to new possibilities. Personal redemption starts here.
Welcome to the Disruptive Response Podcast.
It's your time to shine.
Okay, so Grant, this is my friend Ed. Ed, this is Grant. Ed is a former firefighter and paramedic. He's also the owner of a Firehouse Subs here in Arizona and first responder Decon. And he's just an all-around great guy. And I'm really excited for the two of you to get to talk. Ed has some similar experiences to us and what we talk about on this podcast. So I wanted to introduce the two of you guys and really just have conversations because it's very rare that we hear men talk about this topic. So Ed, thanks for coming on with Grant and I.
No, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me, you guys. Been following what you guys are doing. Appreciate what you're doing. You know, there's to kind of know that you're not alone in the things that you've been through and the way that it's affected your life and in how you've overcome it is huge. I know it was huge for me, and I'm hoping that it's going to be huge for other people around the world as well.
Ed, honestly, dude, it is a pleasure to have you on our podcast tonight because I just think this is something that will be very, very rare to find, in the circumstances that we have. You're a big, burly sort of ex-firefighter, and bringing that masculine energy to this actual interview, if you want to call it that. I think this can really sort of reshape how our society looks at people who have been through abuse before. It's this, as we've spoken about before, it's this taboo topic that's kind of like, in appropriate circumstances, we can have an open conversation about it, and just to show the world that it happens to so many people. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because, like you said, hey, you're a big burly guy, you're a big burly firefighter guy. Anytime you talk about, and I'm recently divorced, been divorced for about 3 years, and my wife was a petite lady, she wasn't a very big lady, and so when you talk about abuse that you go through, so she was actually physical. I mean, she would get ticked, and she would straight up with a closed fist when she could, and I wasn't looking, she'd punch me in the side of the head, But when I would tell people, I went through abuse, or when it came out in the divorce papers and it showed that there was domestic violence in the marriage, people couldn't believe it. A judge wouldn't believe it. Lawyers couldn't believe it because they're like, well, you're bigger than her. It's like, well, yeah, did she do a lot of damage? Well, she rung my bell a few times. But the societal acceptance of your physical stature compared to her physical stature, it's like, yeah, I just can't believe it because you are bigger than her. Well, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, And then you add to it to be able to be this big burly guy, especially if you've even had some success and you've moved on with your life. It's hard for people to believe, well, when you were 4, what happened to you? Who did what to you? And that's even more taboo to talk about.
It so is, man. And look, we don't expect you to go into too much detail with your story. It's just whatever you feel comfortable with. Because, even just sharing what you've shared there, that's more than probably 99 out of 100 guys will not do. And as you, that's perfectly painted the picture for me that, just because you're big in our society's expectations doesn't mean to say that you can stop the abuse from happening. In that case, correct me if I'm wrong here, so your ex used to just hit you and all that sort of stuff, and that's just how it was, kind of thing, or?
Yeah, and she felt justified in it because she was smaller than me. To her it wasn't abuse either because I'm a big guy, and yes, it didn't hurt me that much unless she blindsided me, and like I said, then it rang my bell. There was a couple of times where I saw stars, but you go back to the effects of, I'll just start up, and I hope I'm just going to unload here and talk about, my experiences, the things I went through, how it affected my life through most of my life, and even how I started to overcome it and why. What were my triggers that got me to want to start fixing this? My family was a great family. I had a wonderful family growing up, but there was abuse there. And it's funny because even as an adult, after having worked through things, and I'll talk about this in a minute, I didn't even realize who it was. I was molested as a child. Between the ages of 4 and 7, I was molested. And it wasn't until 2 years ago, when I was 44 years old, that I actually realized who had done it to me. I thought for years it was an uncle. I thought maybe it was a friend of the family. It was something I tried to talk to family members about. I tried to talk to my parents about, and they'd be like, "Oh no, I don't know who would have touched you." But I knew at a very young age. So looking back on it, I was 6 years old, and I didn't know the term for it, but I knew what a blowjob was. I knew that sometimes people put penises in a mouth, and I was 6 years old when I first remember having to talk about that. And I was talking about it with my male cousin, who was a year younger than me. And it wasn't until we were older talking again about it, going, who did this? And he couldn't remember who had done it to him either. And it wasn't until 2 years ago, I'm having dinner with my dad. And I brought it up to him again. It's just the two of us having dinner. And I said, hey, I just got to ask you this. I said, it's more out of curiosity because I'm really trying to put the nail in a coffin on a few things that affected my life as a kid. And I said, do you know if I was ever molested? And he goes, that is such an odd question. He goes, before I answer it, why are you asking me this? And I said, well, because I've had some things come up for me when I was in my early 20s that I really had to work through. And I know I was. I said, and I even can tell you what happened, but I can't remember who did it. And he goes, this is really crazy. He goes, I finally went to counseling after all these years myself. And he goes, I totally didn't remember this until now. And again, my dad's in his 60s, and this was 3 years ago for him going through counseling for all this. And he goes, I didn't remember, but Aunt Pat, Patricia, my Aunt Pat, molested me when I was a kid. And it opened floodgates. And I said, Dad, who babysat me when I was a kid? Who was the one that taught me music when I was a little kid? Who was the one that gave me my cello lessons and I would spend hours with? And his face basically went white. And I said, it was Great Aunt Pat.
Oh,
and so it was, we're talking a generational thing. Now my great aunt she passed years ago of muscular sclerosis. And so there's nothing to face there. But it's interesting because my father himself had been molested by the same woman, but he had repressed it for years. Now, again, same thing as me. He knew that something had happened because he was very sexually energized as a child, especially all up through his teenage years, but he couldn't remember who did it. And it wasn't until he was in his 60s when he really started focusing on some serious meditation, some serious work, that his floodgates opened. And it wasn't until he mentioned it to me that it went, wow, and that block or whatever it was that was as my survival method or whatever finally got out of the way. And even since then, I've still had memories pop up that are actual memories of what happened. It was a really good conversation between the two of us, between my dad and I, about it. And I felt bad for him because he immediately went into apologizing. And he's like, son, my God, if I knew, and I was like, it's not your fault. You can't take ownership over the actions of what someone else did. You can't. And I don't know how much Jelena has shared with you. Jelena and I have had conversations over the last while about what all my life has been like. But in my early 20s, I struggled sexually through my teenage years. And the weird thing was what I craved was a positive sexual experience. To me, sexuality was ugly. It was a gross feeling. And I craved a good sexual experience because I knew that in my mind, it was supposed to be a good experience. And it wasn't until I read the book. It was a mentor of mine. Oddly enough, I was homeless once, living in a car, just bad financial decisions, and I've been living in a car while I was trying to get on my feet. And this billionaire took an interest in me and started mentoring my life. And the first book he had me read was The Four Agreements. And
awesome book.
Have you read it?
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, totally unlocked my belief system and all of the events in my life that caused those beliefs to dictate my reactions to events. And it just totally changed my life. I went from living in a car to doing very well in the music industry in Nashville in like 7 years, just from unlocking all of those beliefs that I had wrapped up around that. But I went to a therapist around the same time to try and deal with these sexual things that were coming up. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of book smart therapists that are out there, and they're conditioned to step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And I'll never forget this. The first time I had gone to a counselor for sexual things, to talk about having been molested. And, he asked me, he goes, yeah, definitely, I think you've been molested. And I said, well, yeah, I'm pretty sure I have. I was 6 years old, and I could tell you what a blowjob was. And he's like, all right, this is what we're going to do. It's going to take about a year, but we're going to do some real intensive therapy. We're going to remember who it was. We're going to remember what happened to you. If we have to do hypnosis, we're going to do hypnosis. And I've got these books that I want you to read, and we're going to bring up and talk about everything that happened to you. He goes, and usually it takes about a year. And then once we finally have it all come up, then we'll start dealing with it. Yeah. And I remember him talking for about 5 minutes, and I was looking at him like he had grown a third head, because I thought it was insane. And we're the only animal on the planet that after a trauma has happened to us, we use our memory and our imagination to relive that trauma over and over and over again. And I looked at him and said, I don't need to do that. And he goes, yes, you do. It's the only way you're going to get it done. And I said, no, I can just let it go right now. And he goes, it's not possible. And I go, sure it is. It's called forgiveness. And he's like, but you don't even know who did it to you. And I said, I know. I don't, but I don't need to. I can still forgive whoever it was and give it up to them and stop reliving this every day of my life. And it was the Four Agreements, basically, that taught me through that. And the book Mastery of Love, which is another fantastic book by Don Miguel Ruiz. Yeah. That was where my life sexually started to change for me, as far as I stopped needing and craving or I guess pursuing that positive experience with it, and I just allowed it to be what it is. Yeah. And, one of the things that I did, and so when I coach people, this comes up quite a bit. I began revisiting the traumas of my life, and that was one of the earliest traumas that I could remember. And what I visualize is, at the time I was 22 when I read the book. And so I pictured my 22-year-old self walking into the room where my 4-year-old self had just been molested. Yeah. And I imagined picking myself up and holding my 4-year-old self in my arms and saying all the things that I needed to hear in that moment to process it. Because when you have your traumas, you process them at the age you go through them. And very rarely do you ever go back and reprocess them with maturity and wisdom. So I was 22 walking around with a 4-year-old's version of a processed trauma. Yeah. And so I reprocessed it as a 22-year-old. And the way I did that was picking my 4-year-old self up in my head, because I'm a visualizing person, and saying, Eddie, I love you. Eddie, you're beautiful. You're not ugly. What was done to you was ugly. It's their ugly. It's not yours. You don't need to take ownership over this. Sex is a beautiful thing between two people that love and care for each other. And it's a way to connect. It's a way to bring people together. And I talked to myself as that 4-year-old and reprocessed it as a 22-year-old. And I've actually had to go back and revisit that probably 3 or 4 times since then, as I gained maturity, as I gained wisdom, as I gained experience in understanding sexuality and making new agreements that were healthier for me. Yeah.
God, and just listening to your whole story, man, it's so freaking powerful. And the person you have become today, I just think it's so interesting what you've just discussed, even then from a book. You're actually able to heal from your past by doing exactly what you just said. You essentially took your emotional self from an adult back to that child's point of view and shifted it into it's almost like you went back in time as an adult to that point and just rewired your neurology as a child at that point, and that's brought you back into this present day as a more uplifted. I mean, you only have to look at your life now with the restaurant and that sort of thing and what you've been doing, and to me it is the epitome of you moving forward in your life and having success. Like it's just, I just want to acknowledge you for that, man. It's such a freaking amazing achievement that you've done for yourself, bro. Like it's honestly awesome.
I appreciate that, brother. I really do. And one of the questions I get all the time is, why would God allow this, or why is this allowed in our universe, and then why do these things happen? And when I talk about surviving sexual traumas, one of the things, and I'm going to share something very personal here that we went through as a family. I'm in Nashville, living the life, enjoying the music industry, doing the things that I absolutely love. After my first marriage, it had taken me about 2.5 years to get custody of my boys. And unfortunately, in that 2.5 years, my ex's new husband had hurt my oldest son in a pretty severe way. Uh-huh. And the things that I had been through as a child and the work that I had done in healing from that is really the only thing that I think saved me in being able to be there for my son while he went through his own healing. And if I had not gone through that as a child myself and then processed it as an adult, when this happened just a few years later, I don't know how I would have survived it, to be honest with you. The guilt, the shame, how am I as a father and a husband? How could I let my children down like this? How could I not have been there? How could I not have known? So I've experienced it on both sides. One, having been a victim myself, and then two, having been the parent of someone who's a victim and having to try and heal them or help them heal through it too.
Man, I'm sorry to hear that you've had to go through that kind of twice over, and I can't even imagine as a parent what that would be like, having to know it's your child that, as you've just stated, like all you want to do is protect and serve that child to never get hurt. And God, that's such a difficult thing to go through. Like, do you mind sort of sharing that a little of that process, what you did to actually help you stay above board in your mindset? Like, what have you had to do in that case?
Well, to be completely honest, for the first couple of years, I was in survival mode. We packed up everything. We moved back to Phoenix to be around family while we got through it. I can't even tell you how many hundreds, if not thousands of hours of counseling and therapy and EMDR work that we did with my son. And he's 27 years old now and is about to get married. I don't even know how to say how much he has inspired me and inspired others and grown through, because he went through what he went through, and it's his story to tell one day, was way worse than what I had gone through. What that man had put him through, I don't know how people have the imagination to do to other humans, much less to children. And my son, to pull himself up out of that and survive that, was amazing. But I will tell you, as crazy as it sounds, the key to surviving that emotionally and mentally is two things: forgiveness and love. And he is one of the ultimate examples of forgiveness. And I'll tell you my experience with this. I started, even though I had read the 4 agreements, even though I actually spoke at conferences, even back then I would go and speak about overcoming personal obstacles and whatnot. When this trial hit me, I sank back into starting to hate people. I mean, I hated this man vehemently. I'll be real. I wanted him to die. Like I spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to legally pursue him to have him prosecuted. I was so angry and wanted to put everything that I had at that man. But it had been, I had custody of my kids for almost 5 years before all this came out. So there was no physical evidence. They said all they had was the evidence of a mentally confused kid, so they wouldn't prosecute him. I tried state, federal, county. I tried everything. And there's even more stories behind that nightmare. But what came down to it, and this is what was crazy, was taking my daughter to college up, and this guy lived up in that area where she was going to college. And I walked into a gas station bathroom and swore he walked in behind me. I thought it was him. It was the same white trash wife beater, greasy hair, thick bottleneck glasses. And I realized in that moment that I was about to kill a man. And I wasn't going to shoot him. I always carry when I travel, and I wanted to do it with my bare hands. I literally envisioned my hands around his neck, watching the life go out of him. I had that much hatred and anger inside of me. And it turned out not to be him. And it was like his doppelganger. And so when I talked to the guy, I realized it wasn't him. I got in the car, and at the time, my wife was, like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll talk to you about it later." But for hours after that, all I could think about was, if I had actually gone through with it, how would that have affected my family? I would have gone to jail. Even if I won on an insanity plea, it still would have put them through more hell than what they were already going through. And I realized that I didn't have the emotional energy to hate him and love my family the way they needed to be loved in order to help them heal. So that night, I went for a walk. After we dropped my daughter off at her dorm, we got our hotel room. I went for a walk, and I found this park. And I got on my knees and I prayed. And I said, "Father, I know you love this man." I said, "I know he's your son. I don't understand that kind of love, and I hope one day I do." I said, "But right now I can't hate him and love my family like they need." I said, "So I'm going to give him to you, and I forgive him." And I prayed a little bit longer, but I stood up and I let him go completely. I let it go. And the healing in my family after I did that shifted. And it just seemed to flow much more smoothly when I got out of my own way with that. And here's the crazy part. You fast forward 2 years later, my son graduated with honors from high school, full ride scholarship to NAU. And in the mail, I receive a newspaper clipping. And it says, "Michael Hazlitt struck by lightning and killed during freak lightning storm." And that was the man that had molested my son.
Okay.
You're shitting me.
No, he was riding his horse. According to eyewitnesses, he was riding his horse when a freak cloud came up over the mountain, struck 3 times in succession while he was trying to ride away. And on the third one, it hit, killing him and the horse. And
that's incredible.
That's karma. Eat your heart out right there.
When you turn things over to God, he'll eventually take care of it. But this was a great moment for me because my son came home from college that weekend, and I didn't tell him about it until he got home because I wanted to be in front of him because I didn't know how he was going to handle it. And I handed him the newspaper clipping, and I sat on the ottoman. He sat in the love seat, and I just watched him read it. And he goes, "Huh. Well, I wonder what the horse did." He's like, "The horse didn't deserve to die." And I laughed, and he goes, "Man, it sucks for him. He's going to have to face God now." And that was the moment I knew that my son was healed and was moving on with his life. But there's so many stories in there. I mean, we could go on about how broken our system is to support and help people deal with sexual traumas. We could talk about, the therapies that don't work compared to the therapies that do work. And it's such a big topic.
Oh my God. There's just so much I want to be able to say here, and I almost don't know where to start. But the one thing I do want to say is that if you're a listener, right now, the thing that I really want to, shoot home here is that Ed has just spoken about when he was in that anger and that frustration, his family also couldn't heal as quick when he let go and he could forgive, his family was able to heal as well. And what I heard there too, Ed, was that your family connection now is just incredible. Like the connection you have with your son now, the fact that you could just talk about that horse and you could just joke around about the horse. Like, I mean, that is such a unique thing. And I think if you're a parent out there now listening or watching, like, this is something that if you haven't experienced it before, or your child has had something happen to them, God forbid, the longer you hang on to that anger and that hurt, the slower it's going to be before your child can also move on, because they're also going to see your hurt and feel guilty because of your hurt. Like, and so when you can heal from that, and I'm not saying it's an easy feat to do that, but do your best to heal, because that can help your child to move forward. And man, I mean, Jelena, is there anything that you want to kind of touch more on that as well, or?
Yeah, well, Ed, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And, I know we've talked about that personally, shared our experiences in conversations before. But I just totally appreciate that you're willing to share this for everybody else to hear your story and how far you've come, how far your family and your son has come. And it's amazing to give people those examples of somebody who has been through so much, but they're able to persevere and succeed. And I think that really gives people hope. And so I want to thank you for giving other people hope. And then I'm going to go way back to when you first started sharing, when most people think about sexual abuse, they think about males being the offenders. Right. Most people don't acknowledge the fact that women are offenders too. It's maybe not as common, but it happens. And so, you guys talked about you're both big, burly men, and so masculine and firefighters, and, people look at you and they would never imagine that the two of you strong men have been through such shitty trauma in your life. And so to just acknowledge that this has happened to you and that it was a freaking female that did this to you, and to have these conversations that so many, masculine men don't have. I think that you guys are incredible. You are both incredible to be sharing this, because it's happening to too many people. It's happening to too many men, to too many little boys. And it's something that we need to talk about so we can stop it. And so thank you so much for that. And then I want to go back to how you talked about forgiveness, because I know when, for my story personally, my stepfather sexually abused me throughout my childhood, and forgiveness was the one thing that was huge for my healing, but it was the hardest part for me, because I had the misconception, which I'm sure a lot of people listening or watching right now have this misconception as well, and they probably cringed when they heard you say forgiveness and heard you speak about forgiving. They were probably cringing. They're still probably cringing, because the misconception is that the forgiveness is for that person. Right. And it's not. That person never needs to know that you forgive them. And it's not for them, it's for you. Because when you're holding on to that unforgiveness, it's like festering wounds, that will never heal. And so when you forgive, it's releasing all of that burden from you. And it's allowing those wounds to heal. And so I love that you spoke about forgiveness, because that's the hardest part for, I think, anybody of any kind of, victim to do, is to forgive. But the forgiveness isn't for that person. They don't deserve it. They do not deserve it. They don't need to know that you forgive them. But it's for me as well. As soon as I did forgive, for my benefit, it really opened the doors to healing. So I really appreciate that you talked about that as well. So yeah, and incredible.
I think you're spot on. A lot of people mistake forgiveness for acceptance. Mm-hmm. Yes. They think that when I forgive you for what you did, that means I'm also going, oh, it's okay. And that's it. And I can't remember where I heard it. I heard it. It was over the last couple of weeks that it was someone that was speaking, saying that one of the things their father taught them was, when someone says, forgive me, don't respond with, that's okay. You can respond with, I accept you forgiving me or whatnot. But yeah, forgiveness and acceptance are two different things. They don't go hand in hand. Forgiveness is saying, I'm no longer going to carry this. I'm giving it back to you. And,
Right.
there's no way I will ever accept what that man did to my son. However, one of the crazy things that happened after my forgiveness and after I gave it up to God was I began to have empathy for that person. And this might make more people cringe, like you're talking about. But I was able to find out, because a lot of the things that I had done with hiring an investigator and trying to get police officers to do more background work, is I had found out that guy, Michael, had actually been molested by his blood mom, his blood dad. His actual parents had molested him since he was a child. And then when he fought back, he was adopted out by his aunt and uncle, who also turned around and molested him as well. And even though, again, it doesn't justify what he did to my son, I began to have empathy for the man and understanding why he had done what he had done. Again, no justification in it. But if I had never offered that forgiveness, if I had never given that up and stayed on my hatred and anger for him, I would never have been able to open my heart up enough to have that kind of empathy for him. And there was so much power behind being able to have empathy for someone who has actually harmed you.
Yeah. It's so fascinating you brought that up, Ed, because when I confronted the guy that did my sexual abuse, one of the things that I came from a perspective of like, right, I'm going to go and, because I've spoken to Jelena about this before, so my mythology when I went there was, one of the things I valued is protecting. I guess kind of that's hand in hand with the firefighting, that kind of stuff. I've always liked to fight, to protect, and because it was external to me, I could go in without this, it's like not about me kind of thing. So when I confronted him, I was just like, look, I've come to hit you up about the past because obviously it's affected me over all these years and it's just eaten me alive. I need to say something, but I'm here to, help you get some help. And I think the first thing you need to do is talk to your wife. And he point blank just refused to talk to his missus about it. And it was interesting that he brought up that he was molested when he was 7 years old. And there was something else, 7 years old. And there was something else as well. I can't remember what it was. But now that could have just been a story that he told me to try and make me feel sorry for him. Who knows? But probably there was probably some extent was the truth there. And it's interesting that I find there's the people out there, like, even just as you've spoken about, like they get all this trauma put on them and they go out and then do it to somebody else. Right. Whereas there's people like us that want to go out and stop it from happening in the first place. It's a interesting, that's a whole other ball game, the psychology of humans. But I love what you guys both touched on, the forgiveness, because the distinction that I've actually just learned this one of these things about the forgiveness, which is we don't actually have to forgive to heal. And that, like you just said, if I took this correctly, was that we don't have to forgive the action. The action is unforgivable action, what they have done, but we can forgive and actually let go of that hurt, or heal is a better put. When we can heal from it, then forgiveness is kind of almost just a natural response that comes with it, because we've healed ourselves and we're not attached now to that trauma or that hurt they put on us, kind of thing.
Yeah, to me, forgiveness is just the key to open the door. Unconditional love is really the only antibiotic that will clean out the festering wound and allow it to finally close and heal. And the closing and healing of that wound only comes from what actions you take after you forgive. Especially like you said, you and I ended up in the service of serving other people. I really think that almost every firefighter, almost every police officer, paramedic, nurse, doctor, and whatnot that I know, people that went into a service role had some kind of trauma. And it was part of their healing is turning around and trying to give back. Some of them never really heal from it, but it's their way of putting a Band-Aid on it or putting a little bit of medicine on it to make it feel better by serving others. And I would love if I could just snap my finger and get a real poll on firefighters, police officers, doctors, nurses, on how many of them have actually suffered some kind of trauma mentally or emotionally in their past.
Well, hey, this is, I guess, the sole purpose behind the whole, disruptive response, because, I mean, it's only 3 now, but who knows what this will turn into when we start opening the floodgates to normalizing the conversation around this, like we've just done tonight. Like, it's not a hard conversation. We've just openly talked about it. And as we've stated before, for the people this has never happened to, this is not for you. This is for the people something has happened, and you may be looking to try and build your confidence in just knowing that there's a community of people out there that have been through the same thing, because that can also be, I mean, a prime example right there, it could have been family members, and the last thing you want to do is open up to your family members. You might have to be external, right, and find a new network of people, which this might be a platform to reach out to us through the community group that we've created to start those connections type thing,
Yeah, and I'm really, really hoping that as people are watching this right now, they're thinking about who they can share it with, who they can pass it on to. And I really hope they're going down in the comments and saying, me too. I want to be a part of this. I'm a guy. I've been through the same thing. I feel it. Give us your information. We need to have more resources and more like-minded people coming together to share their stories so that we don't feel like we have to be alone. And you know what? We can still be macho and talk about having been victimized and traumatized. I would love to see this move forward as a movement.
Absolutely, man. Here.
I love that, you guys. And that's a perfect way to end this episode, because we're right there at the time limit. But I just love that, and I really hope that I'm confident that this conversation is going to be helpful to so many people, to so many men, women, children, and parents especially as well. And so, anybody watching, listening, you can connect with us on Facebook and Instagram under Disruptive Response Podcast. And then we're also over on YouTube and Spotify and iHeartRadio. And you can also connect with us on disruptiveresponse.com and fill out the contact form there. Message us on Instagram or Facebook. Grant and I respond to those. You can also connect with Ed on Instagram, Facebook. I'll drop his links in the show notes, so you guys can reach out and talk to him as well, because I mean, Ed, I'm speaking for you here, but I'm assuming that you're totally okay with people reaching out to you if they feel like they connect with you. You know what? Somebody
Absolutely.
might not connect with me at all, or they might feel like they can connect with you better or with Grant better, and hey, that's okay. But we have our community called Disruptive Responders on Facebook, and that's where we want to continue these conversations. So you guys, this was just the start of a conversation, and there's a lot more to be had and a lot that can continue about this. And all we're doing, and I want to throw this out here because we didn't at the beginning of this episode, but neither Grant nor Ed or I are licensed therapists or anything like that. We're just people, just normal people who have had these experiences, and we come on here and we have conversations about it because we want to disrupt the negative energy and disrupt the silence surrounding sexual abuse. And so that's all we're doing, is having conversations like the ones that you guys just heard or just watched. So come back for more conversations, reach out to us, and we look forward to continuing this. So, Ed, thank you so much. Really
thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. We really appreciate you coming on today. Like, honestly, that was just, even for me, that was just, like, it was so good to connect with someone who even just has that kind of similar experience. It's amazing how the common ground, not that it's really the best common ground, if you know what I mean, but it's, again, that's common ground that potentially will help this to blow up, because common ground, we don't even have to ever talk about the common ground. It can just be a connection tool for people to come together and actually grow their lives to become more successful. And you are a prime example of success, brother, because you have your freaking restaurant, and I can tell you, when I get to come over to the US, I will be there getting a sub, bro. So
nice. Yeah, but my goal is to come down to New Zealand. I've been dying to go to New Zealand for years, so I'm hoping to come down and visit you there too.
Awesome, bro. Well, you just hit me up, mate, and you can come anytime.
All right, I'll drag Jelena.
Yeah.
Hey,
Sounds like a
I
plan.
won't go kicking and screaming. I'll be willing. All
Yeah.
right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.